So you don't have enough to hire a driver for this delivery? It has to be you? Telena asked, bouncing our baby boy Egron on her arm. The boy was named after my wife's father, who had been my uncle's best friend and taught me everything he knew about being a merchant. His lessons were how Telena and I met. She's the reason I am a firm believer in love at first sight. Her father was less than thrilled to hear about our courtship at first, but he came around and endorsed our wedding. He never hesitated to offer aid to us as our family grew, right up until his death just a week before Egron was born. I wrapped my arms around my wife and son and squeezed them tight. Egron, the little scamp, grabbed my ear and tried to put it in his mouth. I could hire a driver, but I wouldn't be able to hire guards for them. I smiled sadly as I twisted my ear out of the boy's grasp. That wouldn't be fair, especially with all that's going on recently. All that's going on recently. What a dull way to describe all the happenings in recent times. Rumor has it that the Drow are planning to start attacking again. There's been a rock slide or something that shut down the adventurer's path to Bolasir, and there's been reports of disappearances on the civilian path. I'm definitely going to need to hire guards. But what if you run into another Nahalim? My darling, I'd rather pay guards and run into a Nahalim myself than hire an unguarded driver and have them run into it for me. I kissed her cheek and put a hand on her shoulder. I'll make sure to hire the toughest of guards, and this will be the last time I have to do a delivery myself. The original plan had been to hire both a driver and guards for this job. If the giant rats hadn't killed my H-Narses and destroyed everything but the metal I was transporting, I'd have been able to stay home with my family and let business take care of itself for a bit, maybe even indefinitely. I'm glad that I hadn't had this conversation with Telena last time. Fate would have made a liar of me. It had better be. I don't know if I can take many more sleepless nights. I thought it was bad just having to worry about Junior, but at least he's an actual adventurer. She sighed. Baba Badla, Egron added, matching his mother's serious expression. I'm sorry, my sweet. At least I won't be fighting any of the monsters, though. I'm not as brave as our son. I smiled and handed Egron his teething toy. As a proper coward, it simply wouldn't do to be charging headlong into danger, so don't worry too much, okay? A bell rang that indicated that the shop in front of our house had a visitor, hopefully, a customer. I kissed my wife's forehead and patted her free arm. It'll be fine, I said. I hope so. I smiled at her and went to see to our potential customers. I walked through the warehouse entrance, sighing as I looked upon all the empty shelves. The ones that did contain goods weren't exactly full either. That would change soon. Just one more delivery, and things would get back on track. I walked through a flap that led into my shop and paused as I saw who my customers were. Hi, Imlor. Nick grinned at me with his oddly shaped teeth. Hello, Nick, I said. I'm happy you were able to find my little shop. Did you come to tell me how things went with the High Chief? In a way, Yulk chuckled, browsing my written goods. We need a ride to Bolasir, Nash grunted, his arms crossed. The elf next door said you were going there to make a delivery for him. Arius? Well, yes, I'm going to be making a delivery for him. Going to be a tight fit if I have to hire more guards, though, I said with a sly grin. I don't mind working for transportation. How much are you paying? Will 50 copper each do the trick? I think 75 would be more appropriate. You seem to be a monster magnet. Come now, brother, Yulk interjected. It simply cannot be his fault that every time we've seen him, we've also seen monsters. It's also a boon that we're getting paid to travel to where we need to go. How about 60? I asked. Nash sighed and proceeded to perform several theatrics that I'd seen dozens of times before. Rubbing his chin, scratching his neck, tapping his foot, all the while pretending to think about the deal I just offered. Of course, he was actually hoping that I'd sweeten the deal a bit. Might as well, it'll still be less expensive than hiring guards from the guild. Plus meals, I added. Within reason, of course. 3 hots a day? 1 hot, 2 cold. You prefer hot dinner or breakfast? Dinner. All right, 60 copper each, and you buy the jerky and stew, Nash said, offering a hand. Deal. I shook his hand. Could I get some meals that have a mixture of meat and veg in them? Nick asked. Stew has proso chunks in it, Nash answered. That's a vegetable, technically. It's a starchy tuber, Yulk added. It's known to help with cramping if prepared properly. Putting it in a stew isn't one of the ways to prepare it as an anti-cramping tonic, though. I remember catching in passing that Nick was able to eat both meat and vegetables, but I had been busy at the time and hadn't given it much thought. The shape of his teeth suddenly came to mind, and it all clicked into place. I can help with this. I usually bring extra fruit and veg bars, I said. I'll share the excess with you. Thanks, Nick said with another grin. Yulk walked over to my counter and set down a well-worn tome that had been collecting dust on my shelf for a few months. I raised my eyebrow at him. How much for this one? He asked. The Musings of Gralv? You can take it, I chuckled. If it weren't for you, I'd say there isn't a soul in this city that cares anything about an imp's opinion on the Fae. A what? Nick asked. An imp, Yulk explained. A small, typically nomadic race that has a bad reputation. My interest is less in the subject matter of the book, and more in the fact that an imp wrote it. They aren't known to be fond of writing. Nothing makes that more apparent than the Musings of Gralv, I laughed. Why do they have a bad reputation? Because they've got plenty of bad apples they don't bother sorting out, Nash answered the boy with a grunt. They'll temporarily settle near a village or town, and once there's been a few thefts, rapes, and murders, they run, instead of letting the culprit face justice. It can't be all of them, though, Nick argued. Right? Maybe not, Yulk said. You rarely see them in these parts, yet even we've heard the stories, though. Unfortunately, that means there's likely some truth to them. Yulk put the book in his pack, settled his staff in the nook of his arm, and brushed the dust from his hands. The conversation got me thinking about the reputation that gnomes used to have in these parts. I grew up with people saying that gnomes were willing to sell their children for a copper if they needed one to screw someone over. That, of course, isn't true for most gnomes, and for every gnome that it is true for, there's an elf, orc, and dwarf that it's also true for. What gave rise to this generalization was that most of the gnomes in Kirkana were merchants of some variety. The reason for that is because most of the gnomes here come from migrants, and being a merchant was the best way for an immigrant to make a living. There's plenty of gnomes in Calcutta that aren't merchants, and it's almost impossible to find a gnomish merchant in Hintran. The unfortunate reality of this generalization is that people automatically assume that gnomes are good at business, and are more willing to trust gnomes that they shouldn't trust when it comes to matters of business. A few years ago, one of the great chiefs appointed a gnome as treasurer. This particular gnome was a blowhard who didn't have a head for any sort of business, let alone civic economics. The gnome in question gravely disrupted the economy of the city. It got so bad that he and several other innocent gnomes were lynched before the great chief's guards were able to put a stop to things. The mob of angry Mer genuinely believed that all of the gnomes in the city, who were also negatively impacted by the bad economy, were somehow involved in a conspiracy to bring the city down. Even after everything settled down, there were attacks on caravans and businesses that were owned by gnomes for years afterward. It must be terrible to live in a place where your neighbors hate you through no fault of your own. I'd like to believe that Kirkina's different, but when are you going to be ready to leave? Nash asked. The carts are all packed up, but I need to pick up some provisions from the Adventurers Guild, I answered. Just as well, we should get Nick's level retested, Yulk said. Really? Why? Nick asked. Because you learned some new skills in our adventures thus far, Yulk grinned. Plus, I'm curious as to how 10 impacts your level. I'm willing to bet you're at least level 6. No way. Sure, he learned a couple of skills, but that doesn't mean he went up a level, Nash said, shaking his head. Right, I interrupted. Well, the carts are out back. Go ahead and load up. I'll be with you shortly. The three nodded and left out of the front of the shop, and I exited through the back flap back into the warehouse. As I entered my home, my wife looked up at me from our kitchen table. She must have set Egran down to play in his room. Customers? She asked. Nope, I answered. Those were the people that saved my butt when I was on the road. Turns out they also need to go to Bolisir, so I hired them as guards, on the cheap, of course. Telena laughed. Always finding a way to save some coin. You sure this is going to turn out all right? I shrugged. It has to. I'm contractually obligated. Even if I weren't, by the time another opportunity like this came along, we'd be starving and I'd still have to go. I know, she sighed. I'm just worried. I don't want to lose you. Telena hadn't always been like this. When I initially went on the delivery to Nulova, she had seen me off with a smile, confident in my return. Something changed when I got home days later than I should have, and told her about the giant rats and the Nahalim. She's been fretting over me ever since. If it were anyone else, I would be annoyed. But with Telena, I couldn't feel anything except loved. I hate to see her worried, but I'd hate it more to see her starving. I love her more than anything, and I'd give anything to see her happy and well. I'll do everything in my power to make certain that you don't, darling. I brushed her hair out of her face and kissed her. I've got to go. I know. She pulled me into a tight hug. I returned the embrace, enjoying the flowery scent of her hair and the feel of her warm breath on my chest. I silently wished that I had become someone's apprentice instead of starting my own business. Some job that would just require me to work some hours and come home to her, safe and sound. Making just enough to keep a roof over our heads and food in our bellies. What more do I need when I've got her by my side? Unfortunately, that was a pipe dream. I'm too old to be an apprentice now, and I don't have any non-mercantile skills that would let me start over fresh. The only way to keep my family housed, clothed, and fed is to revitalize my business. And the only way to do that is to leave Telena behind for a time and risk my life on the open road. I love you more than anything, I whispered to her. I love you more than that, she whispered back. I gave her another squeeze and kissed her again. I'll be back. We waited for a few minutes in the back of the cart before Imlor finally came out the back door of his house. It was an interesting building, a shop attached to the side of his house. The only door on the front I'd seen was for the shop, so maybe this is the front door of his house. That makes some sense if he normally parks his carts back here. The narses were tied to the carts and attached to a stake. They didn't react at all when we'd approached, but I get the feeling that if we tried to pet them, we'd regret it immediately. There was a stable next to the back of the shop, which must be where they sleep. It looked a lot better than the stables I'd seen back on Earth, like someone paid a lot of money for its construction. Imlor untied the reins from the stake and patted each narse on the head. You good? Nash asked, referring to the unexpected wait. Yeah, saying goodbye to the missus, Imlor answered as he climbed into the driver's seat. She's justifiably worried about my health. I wouldn't say justifiably, Nash chuckled. You've got 3 tough guards to watch your back. True enough, but as you said before, I'm somewhat of a monster magnet, Imlor chuckled. No matter how tough my guards are, there's a chance something might hit me from out of nowhere. Yeah, but Yulk knows how to heal, so it'll work out. Assuming it doesn't kill him immediately, Yulk added. Magic can heal, but it can't bring back the dead. Well, not as they were at any rate. Speaking of the dead, I said, if vampires exist, what about zombies and stuff like that? As the cart began moving, Yulk and Nash stared at me. I suppose it hadn't occurred to them that I was ignorant of such things. Nash sighed, but Yulk grinned, likely excited by the chance to give a lecture. Shambling corpses, ghouls, and most other monsters that relate to the death of mortals are all magical beings that have been corrupted by death in one way or another. There is magic to create such fiends, but thankfully it's relatively rare and very looked down upon, Yulk explained. If Nash were to die and rise again as a zombie, I wouldn't hesitate to destroy his fetid corpse. Do you know why? Because it wouldn't be Nash anymore? I guessed. Correct, he said gleefully. Nash will have passed on to whatever awaits in the afterlife. What would then be inhabiting his corpse would be nothing more than a corrupted magical being, one that, presumably, I've never met and as such feel no attachment to. What sort of magical being would that be? There are too many different magical beings to classify them all, and most of them have the ability to possess dead flesh. Both fairies and the Fae, for instance, are able to do so. When a fairy possesses a corpse, it becomes a zombie. When a Fae possesses one, it becomes a ghoul. However, this doesn't mean that every zombie used to be a fairy and every ghoul used to be a Fae. What is a ghoul, exactly? I asked. Where I come from, they're creatures that hang out in graveyards and eat the rotting flesh from corpses. That's almost the exact opposite of what a ghoul is here, Yulk laughed. Ghouls are mutated corpses that crave the flesh of the living like a zombie does, but are much better equipped to get it than a zombie is. Faster, smarter, and much stronger. Thankfully, they hunt solo most of the time, and do so by ambushing those who wander too far from the safety of numbers. Ghouls don't actually need to eat, so they're very patient pests, Nash added. How do you kill one? The corrupted magical being that is reanimating the corpse resides in the brain and controls its function with magic, Yulk said. As such, the only way to terminate an undead is decapitation or to apply extreme cerebral trauma. Fire will technically work, but only because it performs the latter method of extermination. And vampires? Vampirism is a tricky one. Technically, when a mer is turned into a vampire, their magical core is merged with a corrupted magical being, and they in turn become a new type of magical being. By far and large, they retain their identity and memories, as well as the use of any and all skills they possessed while they were alive. Yulk hesitated. If Nash were to rise again as a vampire, I would hesitate to end him. Or re-end, I suppose. Why's that? Vampires don't have to be evil, Nash said. There's been tales of vampire heroes who fought alongside mortals to put an end to those who would try to destroy life as we know it. Which makes the choices that most vampires decide upon all the more tragic, Yulk added. There is a great deal of trauma that goes into becoming a vampire, and the immediate surge in power afterwards is too much for most minds to bear. Wanting others to join you in suffering is a very common trait among mortals, and vampires are in a rather unique position to accomplish exactly that. It doesn't help that shithead vamps purposefully recruit other shitheads, Nash grumbled. Societal leeches becoming literal leeches is all that is. Do you kill them by decapitating them? I asked. Nash and Yulk shared a look. I'm afraid it's not as simple as that, Yulk explained. Since they've become magical beings, they're not limited to their flesh like we are. One must bind them to their flesh through spellcraft or by divine grace, and then entirely destroy their body. Decapitation will help in that regard, but the entire body must be destroyed or the head will simply grow back, or the body will grow back from the head. They have insane regeneration abilities, especially if they've recently fed, Nash added. Even if you chop them up into little bits, they can still regrow their flesh from one of those bits. It's best to bind them, lob off their head, and incinerate the immediate area entirely. Do they actually drink people's blood? I asked. Like, can't they drink animal blood? No, they have to drink the blood of mortals. It's the only thing that will provide them sustenance. They can pretend to be mortal by eating and drinking normal food, and they pass that food in the way one would expect of a mortal. But they'll slowly starve unless they drink the blood of mortals, Yulk said. The aforementioned vampiric heroes had people willingly give them blood, usually a lover or a friend, and didn't take more than they absolutely needed. How do you lot know so much about vampires? Imlor asked, sounding a little unnerved. It's an interesting subject, Nash replied defensively. Might have to fight one someday. Wasn't all that long ago that they ruled the kingdom of night, you know. A few generations now. Anyways, I learned most of what I know from the works of Imlor the Grand's tomes on the subject, Yulk chuckled. Ah, Imlor the Grand. Now that's an interesting subject, Imlor said. Didn't know he knew a lot about vampires, though. Towards the end of his life, he became a little obsessed with immortality, as most magic wielders do, Yulk explained. The experiments he did on captured vampires were more than a little disturbing. I don't want to hear any more than that, Imlor interrupted. I'd rather the mental image I have of my namesake remain unsullied if you don't mind. I don't mind at all, Yulk chuckled. Hey, Ten, are we on speaking terms again? I thought to my AI companion. What do you want? It replied curtly. Do you think that a vampire would be able to turn me into one? Definitely not. Your magical core is artificial, and as such cannot be corrupted by outside influence like a natural magic core can. Your blood also has several differences from the blood of Mer, so it's not even clear whether it could be utilized as a source of sustenance by a vampire. So they wouldn't even be able to drink my blood? There isn't anything about your blood that would physically prevent them from ingesting it. It's unknown whether it would grant sustenance to a vampire, though. I suppose it would either be disgusting or a delicacy. Before I could ask 10 anything further, the cart stopped in front of a very impressive building. Its construction was primarily polished stone that had a dark gray coloration, with wooden details and pillars holding up the roof. The wood had a red tinge to it that stood out against the gray walls. Nash and Yulk respectively hopped and climbed out of the cart, with Imlor and I soon following. As we approached the building, I noticed slight seams in the stonework, as if they had polished massive chunks of stone and stacked them on top of each other. Nash pushed open one of the massive double doors and gestured for us to enter, which we did. I nodded a thank you at him as I passed, to which he grunted. It was unclear whether he was annoyed or appreciative. "I'm going to the quartermaster's dugout," Imlor said. "Meet me there if you're done first." "Understood," replied Yulk. Yulk began to approach the front desk and we followed him. Nash leaned up against the counter as an elven woman wearing a long-sleeved shirt and a vest appeared from a door in the back. "Hello there. How can I help you today?" she asked with a smile. Her smile nearly faltered when she saw me, but her professionalism kicked in. It was obvious that she wanted to ask about me, but decided against it. "We would like to get his level tested," Nash gestured at me. "Certainly. Just a moment." She reached under the counter and pulled out an intricately carved wooden box, which she then opened. She took a machine that looked like the one from the Nulevan Adventurers Guild and set it on the counter. A shiny black box with 6 legs made of different metals. Gold, silver, copper, and I couldn't tell what the other 3 were. One was probably platinum, but the other 2 were strange. One had a deep blue coloration, and the other had a light pink color to it. "Your guild card, please," she smiled. "I have his guild card right here," Yulk said as he passed her my card. He'd held on to it for me while I had my physical, and I'd forgotten to ask for it back. Just as well it might fall out of my pocket during a fight or something. The elf plugged the card into the slot that was facing us and put her fingers into some holes on her side of the box. A bright blue light shone from the top of the box and gathered itself into a perfect square. Green lights soon followed, creating a handprint as well as characters that I couldn't read on the blue square. The blue and green light hardened into something that looked a lot like stained glass. The elf removed her fingers from the box and inserted some papers where her hand had been. "Please place your hand on the handprint until you feel a slight electrical shock," she smiled. Slight electric shock, my ass. When Nima had said that to me, I'd expected something like a static shock. What actually happened was a jolt of electricity shoving its way through my hand and up my arm. I grit my teeth and placed my hand firmly on the damned print. My hand started shaking in anticipation of the shock, but it didn't come. I took a deep breath and managed to hold my hand still, pressing it into the print. I felt a slight tingle traveling up my arm, but couldn't tell if it was electricity or just my nerves, traumatized by my previous experience. I opened my mouth to ask about it when it happened. "Fuck!" I shouted, as a bolt of electricity shot out of my elbow and arced into the floor. Yulk, Nash, and the elf all leapt back as I sank to my knees, holding my now injured arm. "What the hell was that?" Nash shouted. I don't know," the elf stammered. "I've never seen it do that before." "Are you all right, Nick?" Yulk asked, leaning down to check on me. "That fucking hurt," I said as I squeezed my eyes shut to prevent tears from making an appearance. I felt something odd in my mind. It wasn't a sound, but a sort of feeling, the one you get when you're giggling maniacally. It took me a second to realize what it was. "Was that you?" I asked Ten, trying very hard to make my inner dialogue sound angry. "No, but I didn't stop it," Ten continued laughing. "Serves you right. That could have killed me. Not at that voltage," it explained. "It wasn't even close to lethal. Painful? Absolutely. But since you want to be independent, from now on I'll just try to stop things from killing you. You can figure out how to deal with pain yourself." I was getting really tired of this, but I knew better than to blow up at it. That would just make it angrier, and it wasn't like 10 didn't have many other ways to make my life miserable. Instead, I opted for diplomacy. Look, 10, I'm sorry, okay? I should have talked things out with you before the fight happened. You're damn right you should have, 10 interrupted. I know it was frightening, and my unexpected resistance must have absolutely made it even more so, I continued. I understand that you're just as stuck with me as I am stuck with you, and it was stubborn and foolish of me not to take that into account. Correct. Neither of us asked for the situation, and I shouldn't treat you like you're to blame. I'm sorry. Yulk gently grabbed my uninjured arm and pulled me to my feet. Apology accepted, 10 said. The reason that happened is because the stats reader takes some of your mana to determine your current skills and spells, and then returns it. However, your new incorporeal helmet is passively boosting your mana output. The excess energy was the return. How do I keep it from doing that every time? I asked. You don't need to. I can stop it from happening by tightening your channels so the flow is closer to your norm. However, learning to control your mana flow better wouldn't hurt. Are you okay? The elf asked. Yeah, sorry about that. I got a new enchanted helmet and it increased my mana flow without my knowledge, I answered. Is the extra mana going to interfere with the results of the stats reader? I quickly asked 10. No, it only takes the mana to determine your skills and spells. The amount of mana you have is determined separately by Kuriguard through unknown means. Helmet? She asked, looking at my hair. This, Nash said as he swung his fist at my head. I didn't even get the chance to duck before Ares suddenly appeared on my head and rang like a bell as Nash's fist struck it. I reeled back and Nash sucked in a breath as he waved his now injured hand. I found my footing and tried to shake the ringing out of my head as Yulk chuckled. Serves you right, Nash, he grinned. Sucker punching a seemingly defenseless child. Shame on you. It was just a demonstration of the helmet's ability to appear when its wearer is in danger. Nash massaged his hand. I'd hardly call it a sucker punch. I felt my head and found that Ares had disappeared once again. It occurred to me that I have no way to remove the helmet if it keeps disappearing on me like this. I felt a bit of panic before I realized that since I don't feel the helmet on my head until it's needed, there's really no reason for me to have to take it off. Still, I wish I had known that it would be a permanent addition when I'd first tried it on. Right, the elf said, remembering her professionalism. Well, here are the results. She handed my guild card back to me and I looked at it. Some of the characters on it had changed, but I still had no idea what it said. Yulk looked over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. I handed the card to him as Nash raised his eyebrow. What's it say? He asked. Level 10, Yulk said with an uncharacteristically deadpan tone. What? Nash shouted. No fucking way! Gotcha! Yulk started laughing. He's level 7! Gods, you should see your face! You're not funny, Nash said, utterly failing to convince our brother, who continued to laugh uproariously. 2 levels? I got a few new skills and practiced my fighting a bit, but I was under the impression that levels were hard to attain. What happened? Nash noticed my confusion. Probably something to do with 10, he said, pushing me to the side. Move over. I want to test mine. Oh, certainly, the elven lady said. Guild card, please. Nash looked at Yulk, who was doubled over with tears in his eyes. After a few seconds of this, Nash cleared his throat. While continuing to laugh, Yulk reached into his robe, produced another metal card, and handed it to Nash. Nash turned back to the elf and gave her the card. 10, why did I jump up 2 levels? I asked while Nash put his hand on the handprint. The level system has a lot of difficult to account for variables. However, once I was activated, I took the liberty of optimizing your magic core, which has both made it easier for you to cast spells and increased your base mana. This combined with the new skills you've gained is likely the reason. I'm afraid I can't read, and my normal narrator is currently indisposed, Nash said, gesturing to Yulk, who was still hunched over laughing. Could you tell me my level? Certainly you're level 9, she smiled. Congratulations. Thank you so much, Nash smirked at me. Yulk coughed a bit to calm his laughing fit. Yes, congratulations, brother. 1 level closer to marrying Nima. That's, Nash said, turning a slightly darker green. Blushing? That's not the point. I was trying to point out that I learned some new skills, too. I know, Yulk chuckled. Let's go see Imlor and go get our weapons. We need to hit the road. What new skills did you learn, Nash? I asked as we walked toward the quartermaster's dugout. He turned to make eye contact with me and gave me the type of grin that can only be described as evil. Oh, you'll see,